Hello, welcome to Radio Free Flint. This is Arthur Bush, your host. Much has been written and said about Flint's water crisis. There's been an avalanche of television news stories, newspaper articles, all reporting about the crisis. Many journalists have engaged in hit-and-run journalism or exploiting the Flint man-made tragedy by what has become known as disaster porn. In most cases, reporters earnestly seek the truth, while we seek to make some sense out of the morass. What went wrong, how to correct the problems, and who to hold accountable. At this point, authors of books can help us understand what happened, who did what, and what needs to be fixed. Unlike the Bible, there's no one book that seems to have all the answers to life's tangled messes. It is important to seek researchers out who can tell the story about the poison city. In fact, it will take several books to understand the ins and outs of the Flint water crisis because it's an enormously complex event with long-term implications for the people of Flint. Please note that no one person has or will write a book that tells us the whole picture, because that would be an exceptionally large project. We plan to interview these people and ask them to share their research and the implications for ordinary citizens. My guest is acclaimed author and writer Anna Clark, who lives in Detroit. She's a reporter for ProPublica, a nonprofit dedicated to investigative journalism with a moral force. She is also the author of The Poison City, Flint's Water, and the American Urban Tragedy. This book has won numerous awards, including the Hillman Prize for Book Journalism, the Rachel Carson Environment Book Award. It was also named one of the year's best books by the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Public Library, Audible, and others. Our music intro for this podcast is by Colton Art and performs his song, The Flint River Blues. The folk group Mustard's Retreat of Ann Arbor, Michigan, performs the outro song, Take the Children and Run. These songs are about the Flint water crisis. Both songwriters authorize the use of their music. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the episode.
That just shows what the system will do. It'll poison your children and lie to you. You can tell them the facts, they'll still say they're right. They didn't know the truth, well, it's in plain sight.
Okay, we're back, and we have Anna Lee Clark, who's the author of The Poison City, Flint's Water Crisis, and the Urban Tragedy. That was published in July of 2018. You call this an unnatural crisis.
Well, I'm not sure how I came up with it, but the fact of it seems plainly true. So first of all, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this program. I love to be in conversation with you. But yes, an unnatural crisis. And I mean that in two ways. One is that in the events of the last 6 years, I guess, 7 years more, the specific events of how this water crisis was caused and prolonged, all of that was man-made. It didn't have to happen. It was choices. People were making choices, both like concerted choices and de facto choices of neglect. And I also mean it's an unnatural crisis in the larger history of why the city was in such a precarious and vulnerable position in the first place as all the events transpired.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second. How did you get the poisoned in the title of the book?
No, it's interesting you say that because I did originally have a different title. The version I proposed at the start was something was taken off from the epigraph of the book, which is this quote from Toni Morrison. The title I had was Water's Perfect Memory, Flint, Michigan, and the Poisoning of the American City, or something like that. So poisoning was in there, but it was in the subtitle. It goes by the epigraph of all water has a perfect memory. It's always trying to get back to where it was, which I felt was evocative in many ways of this story. But the publisher didn't like that and she felt like the poisoning that was in the subtitle should be punched up into the
She was probably right when it
She was
comes to.
probably right. I think I did argue it because I was like, I had a more, I was like, oh, it's poetic. She's like, no. The point is, I like that the word evokes a lot of the different kind of toxic consequences that happen from this. And it also like put some, a little bit of weight on the fact that it was caused by actual actions. Didn't just happen. There was actual choices that people made.
So when we think of the word poison, we think of somebody, I think about it as a lawyer, as a prosecutor. If somebody poisons somebody, I have to show that they did it purposefully or with some intention. It was not an accident. And I guess that's why I asked the question. This was not an accident is sort of the thesis of the book, isn't it?
A lot of these questions are literally being debated in courtrooms right now about like the level of intention and awareness even. There was many opportunities for this to not be as bad as it was, right? Like there was all these choices. There's a choice to like have this emergency manager that limited the amount of like accountability that was happening. There was a choice to not build out the city water plant with the staffing and resources it would need to treat a more complex water source properly. There was a choice to leave Detroit's water system at all. There was a choice to like do this like weird little temporary switch in the first place, which no other future customer of KWA did. And that's all just like in the lead up to this. There was a choice to not like treat the water with corrosion control, despite that being a violation of federal law. And then as things continued on, as the problems like progress, there was a choice to like ignore people's complaints. There was a choice to dismiss the fact that the water was corroding GM's engine plant so badly that they needed to leave and hook onto a suburbs water plant.
That's pretty powerful, isn't it? When it can mess up the cars, but not the people. Let me ask you a more basic question that authors should be able to answer in a meeting with their editor. What's the thesis of this book?
That's a very good question. What I hope that the book did, I want the book to make plain that what happened, first of all, that what happened here was a story of like profound environmental injustice and erosion of democratic and human rights. And I want to set that in context with the broader history of infrastructure inequality in the city, which hinges on the way that we built our cities in separate and unequal ways. And we did it on purpose. The consequences of that are still playing out today. So this is certainly a story about Flint, but it's also this broader difficult relationship that I think this country has with its cities, which is why we see a pattern of these like hollowed out urban cores surrounded by relatively more prosperous suburbs.
Now, you seem like a pretty successful writer. I mean, when I look at your roster of articles you publish, you're not sitting at home looking for something to do it. And you're a world-class writer. And you could write about any number of things. And you generally have wrote about things that deal with justice and environment, some of these broad themes. Of all the things you could pick in the world, what was it that motivated you to write this book?
Well, first of all, those are kind words. I will say, like, up until just a couple months ago, I've been a self-employed, self-supporting writer, and I'll tell you what, it is a hustle. But one thing I did love especially about being a full-time freelancer, is that there is some room for choice, right? Like I can choosing to follow what matters to me. One thing that really drew me to Flint is first of all, it sort of embodied a lot of stories that I had cared about and written about in the past in different forms, I'd been following the infrastructure and water and emergency manager issues here in Detroit where I am. I'm interested in environmental stories, but all these kinds of things that seem to all come together in this really unique way in Flint. I like Flint, and I came to like it even more as I spent time there and got to know people there. So that drew me to it as well. I felt like the story, even when it got to a lot of attention to truly a surreal degree for a while there, I felt like there was a lot of misinformation, sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes not. A lot of misinformation that was out there that was making it even more confusing despite it having a spotlight on it. I wanted an opportunity. I wanted to be able to tell a story about what happened there that in context of this broader complicated separate, unequal story about cities. And I wanted to do it in a way that like had like some history and some nuance. Like this is what I appreciate the opportunity to have to do a book. 'Cause even when I did some long articles, you just can't everything in, and frankly you can't in a book either. Like this is why we need many many good books, documentaries and all this kind of stuff, and podcasts and so on. But I wanted to like offer some kind of contribution here that would, I hope, have an impact on people and hopefully like inspire folks to think differently about their relationship with their own communities, with their water, with, I mean, we're talking in the like at the tail end of this like pandemic. Like our whole society has had to like think anew about what's essential, right? Like what if nothing must a city do? And certainly that's drinking water. Certainly that includes water, like this basic stuff of life. I hope people like in encountering the story of like what happened in Flint, like think differently about their relationship with that in their own communities as well. I didn't know this until I was working on the book, but it turns out I had a family connection in Flint. My grandmother was born there to one of the sit-down strikers in the middle of the sit-down strike. Wow. Family story that I never knew until I mentioned this to my grandma. I was like, I'm working on this book about Flint. And she's like, oh, here's this little interesting biographical information. I was like, Grandma, why didn't you ever tell me this? That's an amazing story. Right?
Somebody that reviewed your book said Flint's not so much an outlier, but it's a parable.
I think, I guess, inspires a few thoughts. Like one is, in some ways, I think what happened in Flint was escalated to an unusual degree. And I want what was uniquely difficult there to be understood on its own terms and respected and acknowledged. That said, I do think some people have mistakenly thought that if their community isn't Flint or doesn't look like Flint, then they're immune from a lot of what Flint faced. And that's not, I think, the right way to view this either. And in that sense, people interpret it as a parable, then great, like something that they can like learn from, right? I want what is exceptional about Flint's story to be like acknowledged as such, but not to the degree that people think it's like wholly, if they're not a Flint person, that this is wholly separate from them and their lives. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this too. A lot of the last few years, if somebody's had some communities had some like water complaints or some issues, a lot of the defense is like, oh, but we're not Flint. We're not Flint. First of all, what does that mean? And second of all, you might not, that like sort of like knee-jerk defense can in fact cause a lot of those same problems that we did see in Flint. Like, in other words, we have decaying infrastructure, segregation, concentrated poverty. A lot of these things are like problems everywhere that we all have to reckon with. And if people interpret that as a Flint story as a parable that helps them awaken them to that in their own communities, then great.
Well, it's clear that this crisis was a product of disinvestment. The lack of updating of the water infrastructure, the pipes and so forth, contributed significantly to this problem. Flint was designed to be a city of about 200,000 people, and at one time inched up that way. Today, I think your book cited it was 96 or 98,000 or whatever. It's probably down now even more since the pandemic. But we still have all those pipes, and the cost of maintenance of those pipes is extraordinary, especially an aging city. Most of these areas where maintenance has been deferred, it's the entire city. I mean, there's been a big history of robbing the fund that goes into the infrastructure development. There was a lawsuit about whether or not the emergency manager should be taking money out of the water fund and spending it on other things that don't relate to the water or infrastructure. That disinvestment begs the question of whether there should be any investment in certain parts of that city. That's a great debate that really underlies much of what we've seen here, that there's a lot of houses that are no longer here anymore, but there's a whole lot of pipes under the ground. The problem is you can't drill a well there. General Motors totally polluted the aquifer in that neighborhood. And that's not a funny matter. So the question becomes, and it's a question in Detroit, it's a question in Flint, and a question in a lot of cities that are like Flint and Detroit. I think of cities that were once great industrial towns, as to what extent and how aggressive should they be to try and be bold and take action before this problem harms more people.
Well, first of all, I do appreciate how you're talking about this larger structural problem that so many cities that have lost tremendous population and industry, face with their infrastructure, because it is a real problem. And it was like the water crisis in Flint before the water crisis, right? And certainly,
So there was a water crisis before there was a water crisis in Flint.
yeah. It just literally was. I mean, they were losing like a third of their water just through leaks, right? Which of course just makes these bills that are already among the most expensive in the nation, most expensive even before we account for the fact that as a disproportionately poor population. And of course, but even at those rates, you can't even maintain the system you've got, because you have a much smaller population shouldering the burden of it. It's just mathematically impossible. There's just it can't be done. You have these like excessively high water rates in cities that have, first of all, like even if you could afford them, they're too high, but also a lot of people who can't afford them. So there was this like whole spate of like mass water shutoffs, and then there's like illegal hookups, and then there's like prosecutions for it, and then you have these like sort of water security deposits before you can move into a place on top of a regular rent security place, which makes it difficult to move. It was this huge problem, and none of it's like really getting at the root of the problem, which is, of course, as you're saying, having an infrastructure design not just for like more than twice the number of people, but also like a huge industrial sector, right? That consumed a tremendous amount of water. And in Flint, that meant also having like pipes of a large circumference, all of which literally made this water crisis worse. Not just, first of all, like in the story of like what, putting the city in this vulnerable place to begin with, but also the fact that as these pipes are corroding, when the water is like passing more slowly through areas where there's a lot of vacancy, or sitting stagnant longer in these like giant pipes where it's just not moving as fast, then it has more time to get more saturated with contaminants by the time that people draw it from their taps. So this like hollowing out of the population and of the industry while having this like overly large aging water system made the events of this water crisis worse, in addition to like creating a sort of water crisis of its own, of affordability and access and quality. And it's not an easy problem to solve, as you're kind of like intuiting. Like in Detroit, that was like a huge debate of, it was like 10 years ago, there's this whole proposal of like, kind of like what you're saying of like, what if we just like move people into like be more, so it's we're more densely populated. We can't afford to send, services, not just water, but like ambulances and things, when there's like in these like relatively, like to the far field from each other. But it did have a tremendous backlash against that, because people felt like, well, first of all, if you start.
Well, you've got the expense of roads, you've got the expense of streetlights,
Yep.
and you've got the expense of utility infrastructure and all that goes with all that into land that really is not being, that the cost per unit it's just not economic. And your research concludes that that's part of the cause of the Flint water crisis is austerity politics. But when you start to look at austerity politics, that we would begin to look at how to cut down those overhead costs. What would that save a place like Detroit or Flint? It might be eye-popping. Back to your book, the research that you did to do this book does deal with austerity politics. And when you look at austerity politics, did you find that to be the case in the Flint water crisis as part of the reason for the problem?
Yes and no, I guess. Here's one thing that's strange, and honestly, this is a question that's still at the top of my mind that I look forward to understanding more, whether through writing, whether through what comes out in legal proceedings or whatever it is. But basically, this shorthand explanation that a lot of people give for this, what happened with the water story, is they say that like, Flint switched its water to save money. When I looked back at that, I was like, well, I was curious about that. Like, well, exactly how much money, and, what was that looking like at the time, with the information people had at the time? What was like what did the the leaders know? What did the, and consultants know? What did the people know? What were people working with here? How is that conversation going? And the idea of like saving money, like it was honestly like pretty foggy. Flint like went into a significant amount of debt beyond its legal debt limit to join the KWA. In addition
And
to
the KWA is the water pipeline, the new water pipeline to Port Huron.
right, like the kind, so they're going to leave Detroit, which they felt like charged us expensive rates, and we don't have a seat on the board. And this was some of the angst around that, going back, for a long time. And they're like, we're going to join the KWA system, and we're going to finance like a third of its construction that through like bonds, even though the city, because it's broke, is already at its legal debt limit. And this is part of what's come up in a lot of the charges, is people, the kind of workaround was designed to finance that. The water they get eventually from the KWA, they're going to have to treat themselves. It's raw water from Lake Huron as opposed to treated water from Lake Huron that Detroit provided. So they were going to have to indefinitely have its treatment plant in full operation, right? They're going to have to invest in it, and they're going to have to, do the staffing for it, and they're going to have to do that for long term. All of these are like costs that they're taking on to get something it already had in the first place, which is water from drinking water from Lake Huron. If people thought it was going to make their bills go down or at least stop the rate increases, they were also disappointed, because shortly after this water switch, the emergency manager signed a 2-year budget that involved like rate increases that were like up to 12%, I believe. This is going to save the city money. I'm a little bit mystified about, like, it didn't seem to be about what that actually meant, because it doesn't seem to be saving anybody money, neither the city nor the residents. There was a lot of language at the time about how long-term this will save the region $20 million or so, annually or something like that. But like the region, like it was kind of like put in more vague terms. The idea about it like being like an austerity choice, I'm a little bit confused by it, because even though an emergency manager was in town to ostensibly get rid of redundancies and all this kind of stuff, and even though Flint had like truly, a lot of really urgent needs, the thing that we went into greater debt for was to provide something it already had in the first place. So I'm confused by that.
In your research, you basically say that there's been a great deal of government malfeasance, and you spoke to that earlier to some extent, but who is malfeasant?
One is, I do think the folks who are supervising this water switch at the Department of Environmental Quality had a lot of responsibility to make sure the switch was done properly, that the investments were made to treat the water well, that when problems did emerge, that they were responded to effectively, that basically that the city of Flint would be, if we're going to do this whole complex 2-time water switch, that we're going to do it in a way that makes sure that the people of Flint have quality drinking water every single day of that. It didn't happen, despite there being a lot of reasons why, even at the outset, the investments at the plant, the staffing, some red flags that were raised at the time, it didn't happen. And so I feel like that's a problem. And I think later on, there was more problems, that emerged too with folks in the health department and others who were monitoring blood lead tests and some of things like this, some of the information that was not as transparent and accurate as it should have been. The fact that this Legionnaires outbreak was going on for 2 years and killing people, and that it wasn't even made public until January of 2016, when the world spotlight was already had finally come to Flint a few months after it had returned to Detroit. The fact that that wasn't made public is extraordinary.
It's extraordinary because it was the largest outbreak of Legionella in the world.
It's a real problem. The fact, and in other communities, I looked a little bit at this, other communities that face Legionnaires outbreak handled it very differently. One reason you are transparent, even when you're still investigating the cause of it or whatever, is so people can make decisions to keep themselves safe. Pretty crucial information. And it was important to have been transparent about that, so that health providers are doing the proper testing and monitoring. It's widely suspected that a lot of people who were sickened or died of pneumonia over those years might have actually had Legionnaire's disease. The medical information wasn't collected as such or tested as such. Health providers didn't know that was a particular thing that they should be looking for. And the symptoms of it are very similar to pneumonia. that has denied us like an opportunity to have a full understanding of what happened, right? First of all, with the Legionnaires outbreak and what its human cost was, potentially put a lot of people, quite a large number of people at risk for this outbreak.
Now, what are the other unreported stories? When you write a book and you do this kind of research, probably a few pages of notes and a few hours of research gone here or there that you just say, well, it's not really in the lane, but it's tangential. What are some of the stories that we haven't heard yet, or some of the threads that maybe need to be followed up? I mean, Legionella one, they should be, if we had a daily newspaper here, they should be reporting what's happening with McLaren Hospital on a routine basis.
Yeah, there's both like things that I wish I could have included, but I just couldn't.
What was it you wish you could have included?
My book focus is like thinking more about it in this like kind of structural and historic lens, like urban policy and public policy kind of like lens. I hope it's a very human story as well too. Its focus is on this, like why cities are made vulnerable. This is one reason I appreciate Dr. Mona's book, because she provides some of that, and Ben Pauly's book that gets more embedded with the activists, more granular detail about like how. See, this is what, like, no one book can do everything. Like, you need other good things out there. And among us, I think we're hitting different points of emphasis, all of which are important. But if you put it all together in one book, it'd be just too much.
Did you find anything that drew your attention in your research, or the financing of this itself? I mean, Flint went from being a city that was already close to teetering near bankruptcy to now being totally in hock to JP Morgan Chase through the bonds.
Yeah, that's another piece that I would love to go more in depth with, like, right. And I don't feel that door is closed, right? I feel like there's a lot more to ask, and I'm curious about with the money, but it's critical. Trying to understand where people were coming from with the decisions that they were making in the first place, with leaving Detroit, joining the KWA, doing this little temporary system thing.
I found it curious when the drain commissioner, Jeffrey Wright, rationalized this decision in part as an economic development move. You know, there were going to be throngs of businesses coming to Flint that needed water. I didn't quite understand what he was trying to get across, because the reality is that was unlikely, and there's not anything in history that points that was the trend. But did you find anything about economic development, such as fracking for oil?
The interesting things is like the fact that it's like raw water, right? Is the untreated water, which like it just implies that it's meant to be more, if I remember right, like it is meant to be more useful to kind of industrial and agriculture customers, basically, more than individuals who just need regular drinking water. I do think there's this like whole larger question. I do think Michigan is a place where water is our abundance, especially with climate change coming. I think we're like headed into a time where like other places are dealing with quite a lot of scarcity. And I do think that there are a lot of decisions now, and this is not just like with like Flint stuff, it's also with the Great Lakes Compact and other things that are going on. A lot of the decisions being made now are setting really powerful precedents for who gets to decide. The people who control the water are going to be very powerful indeed.
Well,
right?
That would be JP Morgan, wouldn't it?
And the bonds are going to like tell a really important story.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the city of Flint is going to have trouble paying its bills for a long time.
Yeah. And well, it makes it difficult to be flexible, like with, you know, just adapting to like the evolving needs of like the community, like for the folks who are there and how they want to like reimagine their city and stuff like that. I mean, if you're locked in, the more these long-term ways of being like locked in does ultimately limit your choices.
So if you're getting water and you're one of the poorest cities in the country, and you're paying the highest price for water of any city in America, that doesn't give you some options that normally, if you're a good manager, you'd look to see how you could draw that cost down.
You would. I think that would talk about like an economic development thing. Like, what if people in Flint were spending less of their money on these like high water bills and could instead spend that money like in the community, you know what I mean? Like at local businesses or other things like that, or like, enroll in a course or whatever. It's a real burden for people. And even if they can afford it, even if people like have the means where they're like, it's expensive, but I can pay it. It still takes a
Well, I'd call it economic development in reverse, because essentially what you do instead of building up the city is you guarantee its poverty into the long term. Borrowing money to get out of debt has really always been a kind of a bad idea.
Detroit knows this. We know this. It did lead us down a dark road.
I happen to agree with your point of view. I'm sure there are others who don't. And again, it didn't, if you have bad political decision making, that can certainly make things more compound problems. But Flint had bad pipes before bad decisions happened as to the water. But Lansing had the same problem. I found it fascinating that Lansing, before the Flint water crisis, actually addressed this. In one of the articles you wrote, you tell that story.
It is a fascinating story. First of all, like we have aging on infrastructure all over this country, including in wealthier, more privileged, whiter communities. We have lead pipes everywhere and lead plumbing, and despite it being one of the world's best known neurotoxins. And we've never really summoned this, like, the political will to seriously change that. But it just never rises to the top of like, you would need the courage to like take it on because it's expensive, because it might not even be what your voters care about most, the constituents care about most. A lot of people just take their water for granted. The pipes are underground. Like in Michigan, we can't even deal with we haven't even figured out how to fix our roads, even though that's something that people complain about every single day, and it's right in front of us. The infrastructure that's underground, which is equally, if not more, neglected and more essential for our ability to live, visible to most of us. And so it's not the thing that we're calling our mayor about.
Well, in Genesee County, there have been some communities, some governments that have actually taken the bull by the horns. And you know what they've done? They dug up all the asphalt and all the cement that covers the road and turned it back into a dirt road.
Look at that. And that's an improvement. That's an improvement. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's a real thing. Like infrastructure, that honestly, that might be my next book. Like this broader, like, why is it so hard to like build reasonable places to live in? It was very interesting that there was just a couple of exceptions. And Madison, Wisconsin and Lansing, Michigan were like the two of the only cities in the country that had taken this on to replace all their lead pipes, not because there was some like critical emergency in their local area that like required it, not because anybody told them to do, but just because it was the right thing to do. The pipes needed dating, and they shouldn't be made out of a poison. It's interesting to compare Lansing and Flint because they're different in many ways, with Lansing being the state capital and having Michigan State there, but they're also both had similar population sizes. They're both GM towns. Not too far away, Lansing figured out a way to replace the lead pipes over. It was initially a 10-year plan. It did go a little bit over, but they did it. They completed this process. They replaced lead pipes with copper. They figured out ways to do it pretty efficiently. They developed a tool to lace the pipes in and out with minimum disruption. It did involve like some higher costs that were built in like over time, but a lot of people didn't even notice that this was going on. They also said that like just by the fact of doing it intentionally, like they built the skill to be able to be doing this efficiently too. Like, so just the workers were able to like move relatively quickly in getting this done. And by the time this like Flint water crisis breaks out and suddenly every community in the nation is like, oh my God, like maybe this is something I should be thinking about. Suddenly the town of Lansing's getting calls from folks everywhere asking for advice on how to actually do it, because it is so rare, has been so rare for a community to take this on. And it's certainly rare to do so without having some emergency or public relations crisis pushing you to do so.
To wind up our conversation, there's some unfinished business. I think you speak of that in your book, where you make reference to the fact you're surprised that some of these things haven't yet to be changed. One of those was the change in the emergency management law that allows the state of Michigan just to seize governments sort of at will and suspend democracy. What are the other ones?
Sure. Certainly the emergency manager one, which even Governor Snyder's own investigative commission acknowledged as being a contributing factor in what happened in Flint. There have been a number of, some people want to repeal it completely. Some people have ideas to reform it so it can be more workable.
There was actually a referendum on this issue, and the people of Michigan spoke.
Yeah, it's so amazing how this played out. So Michigan had some kind of oversight, as like most states have some oversight mechanism for when communities are really in crisis. The law was expanded in some pretty dramatic ways, giving this administrator like more powers, not just what elected officials would normally hold, but even some additional authority that no elected official would have. It did go up for a referendum. The state, all across the state, so all kinds of different communities voted to repeal it. 6 weeks later, during a lame duck session, it was introduced in virtually identical fashion, although that now with appropriations attached to it so that it couldn't be subject to another referendum. Widely believed that this was a priority because the state was expecting Detroit to be going through a bankruptcy and wanting an emergency manager there with certain authorities. Flint, though, ended up being the first town to be under this more expansive emergency manager. Former Mayor Dane Walling told me he felt like it was like a test case for Detroit, a sort of test case for that, which is interesting. Yeah, so like...
Wasn't he the guy that drank the water on TV?
He was, and I believe he regrets this deeply. But yeah, I did talk to him while I was working on the book, because the day Flint got its emergency manager was the day he was elected mayor.
Michigan's also a secret society when it comes to government, right?
The transparency piece was like another thing. And honestly, this is we're talking about this during a week where like the momentum's really rising in Michigan to change this. It's Sunshine Week, and there's both been a ballot referendum proposed. There's some legislation that's been proposed. Maybe things are going to get better.
So we're talking about Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah. Michigan is one of only 2 states, along with Massachusetts, where both the governor's office and the legislature are exempt from open records requests. On top of this, we also don't require like personal financial disclosures from lawmakers. We have no waiting period before lawmakers become lobbyists. So we end up with this kind of revolving door situation.
One of the other things you said that was unfinished business was disinvestment in the city continues.
The state of this chronic disinvestment in so many of our cities, the ongoing neglect that ends up having the effect of being a violence, against people, a real life and death issue, albeit one that is now taking a form that is we're so familiar with that we're mistaken for normal. It's not normal, and there are choices that we can do to change this. There are choices that led to this situation. That's why it's a pattern. It's why Flint and Detroit and Ben Harbor and communities all over the country, you can see that there's a pattern where we have like abandoned these places, and more particularly the people in them, in a way that I think is deeply dangerous. And while it might not have the sort of eye-catching drama of a water crisis, the stakes are equally serious, because it puts people's lives at risk unnecessarily.
You said that there were 53,000 American cities that exceed the federal lead rule today. And you think that should change?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another thing that Flint's story really unveiled is that we have there are a lot of gaps in our regulations for water testing, including with lead. Michigan now, the good news is Michigan now has a law that is stricter than federal. This is one good reform that happened a couple of years ago. It presents a higher standard for the testing and how much lead it can be allowed. Truly, no lead should be allowed. All lead is bad for all people at all times. We have just decided through our regulations that some of it is going to be fine because it's too complicated to fix it, I guess. The National Lead and Copper Rule, they just went through their first revision process since it emerged in 1991. And basically, one of the things I think we're learning, even when you are compliant with the standards, it doesn't mean your individual household doesn't have an excessive amount of lead in it. The way the rules are designed, it allows for it.
Let me ask you one last question. How is writing about this city, how has it personally affected you? Are you the same person that you were before you started this project? And if not, how did it change you?
Well, in addition to this white streak I have in my hair now, um, it has changed me in mostly positive ways, I think. I think some of the best of it is truly just on a personal level, just getting to know a lot of really great people and getting to know a really great town. It was also like a really difficult process. And even though I was talking to so many people and meeting wonderful folks while working on this book, ultimately, when you have to sit down to write it, you're by yourself. And I think I'm still kind of processing from that, even though it was several years ago, of just like spending the hardcore year and a half or so, where it was like in hardcore writing mode. Like, I feel like I didn't even talk out loud. And ever since, I've been trying to kind of like, okay, now I got to rebalance my life. Now, what am I going to work on next? I still care about Flint stories.
So if you're looking at the people in Flint, how would you describe those persons in Flint in one word?
Passionate is one word that comes to mind. One way or another, there's like some fire there that I think is very powerful and beautiful and a pretty lovely force to have alive in your community.
Well, Anna Clark, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Telephone rings, have you heard the news? Carrion crows coming home to roost. Over at the plant, something went wrong. Take the children and run. They say they'll fix it if we only stay calm. Go back to your factories, go back to your homes. Don't get excited, don't you lose your cool. And those bosses will share their power with you. Take the children and run. Take the children and run. Most politicians lying through their teeth say there's nothing to fear except fear itself. And none of them can tell us if and when it will stop. And they may come and visit, but they won't drink a drop. Take the children and run. Take the children and run. You're on the commission and you're 60 years old. You make a deal with the devil and your profits unfold. But 20 years down the line and that little girl is in the prime of her life and her blood cells grow wide. Take the children and run. Take the children and run. I saw people lined up in the morning haze to find enough water to get through a day. It's the lasting legacy of greed and neglect, and we know the truth, and we won't forget. Take the children and run. Take the children